Moscow, winter 1921. The city no longer resembled a capital, but rather a colossal, exhausted winter encampment. Rows of soot-covered buildings, streets filled with evacuees from the Volga region, where famine had claimed millions of lives. Children huddled in rags, horse-drawn carts carrying corpses rolled through empty streets, and factories that once roared with activity were now just cold steel skeletons. Industrial output was only about one-fifth of 1913 levels. Trade was paralyzed, food was scarce, and the country's future seemed completely sealed shut. But by 1939, Moscow had an entirely different face. Red Square echoed with the roar of steel engines. T-26 and BT-7 tanks rolled in precise formations. 122 artillery and Tupolev aircraft sliced through the skies. New industrial zones stretched from Donbass to the Ural Mountains, working relentlessly, transforming the Soviet Union from the ruins of war and famine into one of the world's largest industrial machines in less than 2 decades. How could a society torn apart by chaos rise so quickly as to defy all economic laws? Who was behind this extraordinary industrial leap, and what was the true price paid by tens of millions of people? The answer leads to 2 centers of power: Stalin, who set the direction, and Gosplan, the planning apparatus capable of controlling every ton of coal, every meter of steel, every labor rhythm across an entire continent. They did not create a miracle through luck or inspiration, but through a model of forced industrialization, cold, rigid, and ruthless, to the point that its traces remain intact in 20th century economic history. This is the story of how the Soviet Union built that miracle, fast, fierce, and leaving scars that never fade. At the end of the 19th century, as Europe entered the age of steel, electricity, and machinery, the Russian Empire still lagged in an outdated agricultural garb. Over 80% of the population farmed. Productivity was low, steel and coal output was only a small fraction compared to Britain and Germany, and the railway network, the lifeblood of a modern economy, was too sparse to transport goods across a territory nearly the size of a continent. While London and Berlin exploded with new technology, Russian factories often lacked electricity, machinery, and even engineers capable of operating large-scale industry. An empire vast in expanse but lacking economic depth was racing against rivals it could not keep up with. By 1914, when World War I broke out, those weaknesses were no longer development issues but fatal vulnerabilities. The railway lines quickly became overloaded and paralyzed. Trains carrying military supplies jammed midway. The army lacked guns, ammunition, and even boots in winter. Logistics collapsed, causing soldiers on the front to starve, while back home, food prices skyrocketed to the point where people queued for hours just to get a few slices of black bread. An empire trying to fight a modern war with a previous century's economy could not stand for long. In 1917, accumulated rage erupted into 2 consecutive revolutions, February toppling the Tsar, October bringing the Bolsheviks to power, leading to the collapse of the entire political structure that had existed for centuries. But that was only the beginning of the chaos. From 1918 to 1921, Russia plunged into a bloody civil war between the Red Army and the White Guards, with interventions from multiple foreign powers. Railway lines were destroyed, coal mines shut down, factories closed, trade vanished almost completely. In many regions, industrial production fell to medieval levels. In cities like Petrograd, the population dropped by half as people fled to the countryside in search of food. The financial system disintegrated. The ruble depreciated to the point where merchants refused payments, and the economy fragmented into hundreds of self-sufficient zones, each locality fending for its own survival. When the smoke of civil war temporarily cleared in 1921, what remained of the Russian Empire was not a nation recovering, but an exhausted body, industry in collapse, agriculture devastated, millions dead from starvation, and faith in the future nearly vanished. That was the context the Soviet Union, the newly established nation, faced: a vast but ruined land, an inoperable economy, a deeply divided society, and a new government with nothing but the will to survive. A state like that could not develop. It could only collapse or be forced to change at a speed fast enough to counter the destruction history had just inflicted. And it was in that choice between survival and collapse that the seed of the forced industrial miracle began to take shape. In the ruins left by the Civil War, the Bolshevik government understood that without creating some breathing room, the young state would collapse before it could even stand firm. NEP, the new economic policy, was born in 1921 as an economic emergency measure, allowing peasants to sell surpluses, permitting small private operations in trade and services, and letting commerce resume within certain limits. After years when everything was militarized and subject to forced requisitions, NEP was like a slightly open door, allowing a bit of market air into an economy that had been suffocating for too long. And it worked. Markets had food again, merchants reappeared, cities gradually became more lively, agricultural output recovered. Light industry production also inched up. In the first few years, people felt as if the country could finally step back from the brink. But that recovery was only surface level, and those in power knew full well it was not enough to propel the country forward. Russia's three biggest bottlenecks, steel, machinery, and capital, remained completely unresolved. Without steel, factories could not be built. Without machine tools, heavy equipment could not be produced. Without accumulated capital, no major industrial leap could be financed. NEP activated small-scale trade, but left the economic structure unchanged. Fragmented agriculture dominated GDP, heavy industry was nearly stagnant, and labor productivity was so low that it could not compete with any European power. The Soviet Union under NEP existed in a strange gray zone, too modern to revert to a peasant economy, but too backward to enter true industrialization. A half-feudal, half-industrial state could not meet the ambitions of survival in a world where Germany, Britain, Japan, and the United States were surging ahead in technology and military power. By the late 1920s, a big question loomed over the leadership. Could the Soviet Union accept slow, stagnant growth, waiting decades to build industry, or must they do what no one had ever tried, forcing the entire country to accelerate at any cost? For Stalin, that question was not academic. It was a matter of life or death for the Soviet state. Observing what had happened to Russia in World War I, witnessing the Ottoman Empire's disintegration, seeing Japan's extraordinary industrialization in just a few decades, Stalin reached a cold conclusion. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must close that gap in 10 years, or we will be crushed. To him, NEP was pain relief, not a cure. It stabilized social psychology, but did not prepare the country for the coming confrontations with the capitalist world. It allowed people to breathe, but it did not give the state the productive power needed to survive. And in that context, much like Germany amid the 1931-1933 crisis, the Soviet Union began sliding into an extreme moment of choice. Continue the slow, socially acceptable path, or step into a model of unprecedented forced mobilization in human history. Stalin did not hesitate. NEP was deemed too slow, too weak, and too conciliatory for a country racing for survival. The era of gentle curves ended. A new era, harsher, more resolute, and terrifyingly effective, was waiting ahead. But to turn that cold conclusion into reality, the Soviet Union had to resolve the increasingly fierce internal struggle, continue NEP or abolish it completely. The Bukharin faction believed the correct path was patience, letting small-scale markets develop, allowing peasants to accumulate, letting light industry feed heavy industry. They believed in a slow but stable process, avoiding social shocks and preserving some rural self-management. But to Stalin, that logic was suicide. He viewed the world not through an economic lens, but a survival one. And in that lens, speed was the only weapon that could save the country after 3 consecutive wars in less than a decade. He wanted forced industrialization, wanted to change the social structure from the roots, wanted to build military power large enough so the Soviet Union would never repeat the disasters of 1914 or 1918. And he was willing to use every tool to achieve it. The confrontation between the two visions quickly turned into a power struggle. In the party, Stalin gradually seized key positions: organizational secretary, personnel dispatcher, controller of local appointments, positions that seemed administrative but held the power to determine the nation's future. When Lenin died, that power network became the foundation that helped Stalin gradually push influential rivals, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, to the margins. By the late 1920s, only Bukharin remained as the final obstacle blocking the Soviet Union from entering the era of forced industrialization. Once Stalin secured a majority in the Politburo, NEP's fate was sealed. Bukharin was removed. The NEP supporters lost control of the press and planning agencies, and the state machinery began shifting according to Stalin's will. From then on, the Soviet economy was steered with a speed and extremism that Europe had only witnessed in Germany in 1933. But unlike Germany, the Soviet Union did not do it through mass movements, but through the absolute power of a totalitarian state. Secret police, media control, administrative coercion, internal purges. No more debate, no more compromise, no more blending of market and plan, only one direction: industrialization through state power and the fear of millions of people. And it was from that moment that the biggest question emerged: how could a country without capital, without technology, without markets, industrialize at a speed exceeding all conventional economic models? Without investment banks, without industrial capital, without trade links to import machinery on a large scale, how could the Soviet Union produce steel, coal, electricity, the essentials for any production leap? Stalin's answer was simple, to the point of terrifying: if there is no market, replace it with coercion. If there is no capital, take it from the countryside. If there are no engineers, train them by decree. If society is not ready to change, force it to change. In Stalin's hands, industrialization was no longer an economic strategy, but a military campaign, an unprecedented total mobilization, where the entire country was treated like a machine that had to run at maximum capacity, regardless of the price paid by the gears inside. It was from here that the Soviet Union's forced industrial miracle began to take shape, bit by bit, through risky, ruthless choices that were decisive for the empire's fate. If Stalin was the one who set the direction, then Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, was the brain calculating every step of that colossal shift. Established with a seemingly impossible task: redesign the entire economy of a continent, Gosplan operated like a nerve center, where thousands of experts, engineers, statisticians, and planning cadres sat before thick files containing data on every coal mine, every wheat field, every power plant, every railway line. They did not just predict output. They had to calculate how many tons of ore could be extracted in Kuzbass each quarter, how much coal was needed to run the Magnitogorsk steel furnaces, how many trains had to run daily to haul ore from the Urals to the Volga region, how many megawatts had to be added to keep factories running non-stop. In an economy without market guidance and without prices as signals, everything had to be calculated by hand, forecasted with mechanical models, and imposed by decree. It was not planning in the traditional sense. It was engineering society by force, engineering the economy by force, where people, resources, time, and space were all reduced to lines in pre-digital Excel sheets. The combination of scientific calculation and political violence made Gosplan a form of power that no Western state apparatus could compare to. When Stalin decided to double steel output in 2 years, Gosplan had to find a way to make it happen, regardless of whether resources were sufficient. When Stalin ordered a factory moved from Ukraine to Siberia for security reasons, Gosplan had to plan the relocation of all machinery, tens of thousands of workers and their families, build temporary housing, lay temporary railways, and restart production in the shortest possible time. Every need, every goal, every dream of the supreme leader became a problem Gosplan had to solve with no right to refuse. They did not just calculate what should be done. They calculated what must be done at any cost. That power, the power to set targets and force the entire nation to chase them, turned Gosplan into a collective dark wizard of the 20th century. There was no single shack making decisions. There were thousands of people sitting in smoke-filled rooms, relying on crude statistical tables to decide the fate of millions, from who had to leave their village to work in the city, to how much meat, sugar, kerosene was distributed each month. And Stalin, fully aware of this machinery's strength, granted them power that no technocratic agency in history had ever possessed: the power to control the breathing rhythm of an entire society. No enterprise could set its own prices. No peasant could decide how much wheat to plant. No factory could choose its products. Everything started from a number in Gosplan's planning documents. A paper output order could leave tens of thousands of workers starving to meet quotas, or strip a resource region bare in just a few seasons. This collective became the symbol of a new type of power: cold, emotionless, merciless calculation. A machine that saw no people, only tons of ore, tons of coal, kilowatt hours, and targets to be met. And it was that machine, not the market, not enterprises, not a minister, that built the foundation of the fastest and most brutal forced industrial miracle in modern history. To get the machine designed by Gosplan running, the Soviet Union needed capital, something the economy, exhausted after the Civil War, completely lacked. No financial markets, no investors, no domestic savings, only one place left where the state could squeeze out surplus value: the countryside. And thus, the first trick of the forced industrialization model was born, seizing agricultural surplus. Under the guise of obligations to the state, the government set mandatory grain procurement quotas at prices so low they amounted to confiscation. Requisition teams went to every village, searched grain storage, took all the surplus, and sometimes even the food needed to survive the winter. For peasants, it was a direct blow to their livelihood. For the state, it was the only capital stream that could be converted into hard currency on the international market. The collected grain was loaded onto ships heading to Baltic and Black Sea ports, then exported to Europe in exchange for machine tools, turbines, metallurgical equipment, and production lines from Germany and the United States. Things the Soviet Union could not manufacture itself, but were the foundation for any modern factory. The irony was that while many rural areas sank into deprivation, Soviet cargo ships were full of wheat heading abroad just to buy back lathes and milling machines to serve the industrialization plan. This was the cold logic laying the groundwork for the coming miracle. Peasants grew poorer so the state could grow richer. Wheat turned into steel. Hunger in one region became investment capital for dozens of factories elsewhere. And from that first trick, the entire system began operating under a single philosophy: exploit anything that could be requisitioned to push industry forward regardless of the cost society had to pay. But to make requisition absolutely effective and stable long-term, the state needed control not just over harvested wheat, but over the production process of tens of millions of peasant households. From here, the second trick emerged: collectivization, an unprecedented campaign to completely eliminate household farming and force more than 25 million peasants into collective farms called kolkhozes. For Gosplan, collectivization was the perfect solution. When peasants were grouped into large units, the state could measure output, forecast harvests, requisition centrally, and no longer worry about hiding grain or black market sales. But the implementation was absolutely coercive. Work teams arrived in every village, declaring all assets from buffalo plows to seeds had to be transferred to the collective. Wealthier households labeled kolkhozes were exiled en masse to Siberia or Kazakhstan. Refusing to join a kolkhoz meant being branded an enemy of the state. In many places, peasants resisted by slaughtering livestock to avoid confiscation, leading to millions of cattle, horses, and pigs destroyed in just a few years, shattering the already fragile agricultural economy. The result was catastrophe. The 1932-33 famine erupted in Ukraine, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan, killing millions as grain was requisitioned beyond limits to serve exports and industrial supply. Collectivization was not meant to improve the countryside. It was meant to destroy the countryside to build industry, eliminating peasant autonomy to turn them into cogs in the machine pumping resources for industrialization plans. From then on, the countryside was no longer a place producing for its own needs, but a mandatory supply source to feed the steel and electricity machine being pushed to maximum speed in the eastern industrial zones. If collectivization allowed the state to control the countryside and food sources, the third trick expanded mobilization in an even colder direction: forced labor in the Gulag system, where people were treated as an inexhaustible resource. While industrial cities desperately lacked skilled manpower, Stalin and the NKVD saw a source of free labor from those considered obstacles to progress: resisting kulaks, engineers accused of sabotage, criminals, suspect intellectuals, and anyone on the unreliable list. In just a few years, the number of people sent to the Gulag exceeded 2 million. They were not just prisoners, but became the core workforce for projects that private sectors or ordinary workers would never accept. Kolyma coal mines at -40 degrees, gold mines in the Siberian taiga, logging camps stretching thousands of miles, and especially the Belamor Canal, where hundreds of thousands of prisoners worked non-stop with shovels and picks to dig a canal over 200 kilometers long, a project the West once thought impossible in such a short time. The Gulag operated as a parallel production system: no wages, no choice, no days off. Prisoners were pushed to physical limits, and when exhausted, replaced by newly arrested ones. For Gosplan, this was not a crime but a calculation. Each prisoner equaled a number of labor hours, a quantity of coal extracted, a volume of timber, a canal segment. The cost to maintain them was just the minimum ration to sustain a few months of heavy labor. This was how the Soviet Union valued humans as resources, on par with iron ore, coal, or timber. It was this forced labor that allowed dangerous, inhumane, and extremely grueling projects to be completed at astonishing speed, a speed the state praised as proof of the superiority of the Soviet model. But behind it was the cold truth. Every advance in heavy industry bore the marks of sweat, blood, and bones of millions, treated as consumable material in the industrialization race. If the Gulag provided forced labor for the harshest projects, the fourth trick was the engine making the entire system run beyond limits: the 5-year plans with unrealistic targets no normal economy could meet. When Stalin announced the first 5-year plan, Gosplan set goals to double or even triple steel, coal, and electricity output in time so short, Western experts thought they were just slogans. But in the Soviet Union, slogans became orders. Figures did not reflect capacity but political will. If targets were too high, local leaders had to find ways to meet them. Failure meant accusations of sabotage. This created a spiral of tension. To prove loyalty, factory directors routinely inflated production capacities, then turned around and forced workers into endless overtime to chase impossible numbers. In industrial complexes like Magnitogorsk, workers lived in temporary tents in -30-degree winters to keep furnaces running. Young engineers worked 14-16 hours a day to meet deadlines for installing imported machinery. At the Dnieper hydroelectric dam, tens of thousands were mobilized at once, working day and night to push progress to record levels, turning a massive river into power for industrial regions in just a few years. A feat even participating American engineers admitted was dangerously fast. These places did not run on technical logic but political logic, finish ahead of schedule, prove the superiority of the socialist model, report over fulfillment even if reality was incomplete. The result was societal exhaustion. Machinery broke down from non-stop operation, workers collapsed from unlimited overtime, leaders lived in fear of purges for delays. But for Stalin, that very irrationality created the speed he needed, speed beyond any economy's natural capacity, bought by burning human strength and resources without mercy. As the plan targets put the entire society into a state of permanent sprint, the fifth trick determined the direction of all that energy flow. Absolute investment in heavy industry, pouring 80-90% of the budget and resources into steel, coal, electricity, and heavy machinery, while neglecting the entire consumer goods sector. In the logic that Stalin and Gosplan believed in, military power and thus national power was determined by the ability to produce steel plates, engines, turbines, tanks, and heavy machinery, not by shoes, clothing, or household goods. Therefore, massive complexes like Uralmash were continuously expanded to produce machine tools and super-heavy equipment. Evacuees was built at a frenzied pace to assemble trucks, the backbone of military logistics, and the Donbass region was turned into the heart of coal mining, with output surging to the point that the land around the mines deformed from overexploitation. All resources from coal, electricity, steel to skilled engineers and workers were sucked into a few dozen key industrial complexes, creating a deliberately skewed growth model. Sacrifice everything to push heavy industry forward. This made consumer goods almost disappear from the market. People queued for soap, clothing, pots and pans as if they were strategic items. Residential areas lacked electricity while metallurgical plants ran day and night. But to Stalin, this was not failure but choice. An economy rebuilt to serve the state, not the people, a model of absolute priority for future war capacity. And it was this extraordinary concentration that pushed Soviet steel, coal, and electricity output to levels that even the most optimistic experts a few years earlier deemed impossible. The flow of capital and resources sucked dry into heavy industry led to the sixth trick, limiting consumption and sacrificing all civilian goods, turning everyday life into a chain of endless shortages. When most steel, electricity, coal, and labor were directed to Uralmash, Evacuees, or Donbass, nothing was left for producing clothing, household items, or building materials. The state implemented a rationing system from bread, meat, sugar, to soap and shoes. Everything was distributed by quotas. In many cities, people lined up from before dawn to get a few essentials. Dilapidated apartments went unrepaired because cement and wood were prioritized for factories. Many families lived in overcrowded dormitories due to severe housing shortages. But in the guns over butter logic Stalin pursued, these sacrifices were not anomalies but necessities. People had to go hungry, so metallurgical plants had enough coal. They had to lack clothing. So the Evacuee truck assembly lines ran at full capacity. They had to live cramped, so steel furnace workers had temporary housing to meet quotas. The entire society was tightened to the point of suffocation so the state could build steel, electricity, and tanks, the things seen as the only guarantee of the Soviet Union's survival in a world where war was always considered inevitable. While civilian life was squeezed to the minimum, the seventh trick pushed the entire model into deliberate imbalance, concentrating resources on a few priority projects, where coal, electricity, steel, and manpower were poured at extreme density, leaving all other sectors to fend for themselves in shortages. Gosplan selected about 10-20 strategic projects, points they believed could create a leap for the entire economy, then drained all resources to feed them. The Ural-Kuznets combined duo became the empire's steel-coal axis, given unlimited electricity and top railway transport priority even when other areas lacked food. The Dnieper hydroelectric plant was seen as a symbol of Soviet power, poured with metal and equipment to the point that other industries had to halt. This approach created extraordinary speed. Super projects finished ahead of schedule, capacity increased exponentially, and steel, electricity, coal output exploded in just a few years. But the price was clear. Non-priority regions fell into exhaustion. Agriculture lacked machinery. Transport paralyzed for lack of parts. Consumer goods factories nearly shut down. By turning a few points into industrial hearts and letting the rest of the country endure perpetual shortages, the Soviet Union created an unbalanced but extremely effective growth model for one goal: maximizing heavy industry capacity in the shortest possible time. The resource flow squeezed into those priority projects was maintained by the final and most brutal trick: technocratic purges, where anyone seen as slowing the pace could be arrested, shot, or sent to the gulag. In an environment where targets were set many times above real capacity, factory directors, chief engineers, workshop foremen, or even Gosplan cadres could be accused of sabotage and disappear overnight for delays, equipment failures, or submitting numbers not beautiful enough. The atmosphere of fear made reports increasingly fictitious, output inflated, quality downplayed, and prettier figures than reality became the only shield against blame. Yet the brutal paradox was that progress still accelerated, not through efficiency but through violence. Workers forced to exhaustion, managers chasing quotas to save their lives, and the entire system propelled by constant threats. The Soviet industrialization miracle was built not just with steel and coal, but with continuous purges, keeping the machine from ever being allowed to slow even for a day. Those purges made the fear-driven machine not only avoid slowing, but accelerate to unbelievable levels, and the results became starkly visible in just a decade. From an exhausted agricultural economy in 1928, the Soviet Union entered the late 1930s as a colossal industrial beast awakening. National industrial output increased 4 or 6 times, a speed even early capitalist powers had never achieved. Steel, the lifeblood of the entire heavy economy, rose from 4 million tons to 18 million tons, pushing the Soviet Union past most European countries, second only to the United States. Coal, fuel for every furnace and every train, rose from 35 million tons to 166 million tons, turning Donbass and Kuzbass into non-stop fire pits. Electricity, the ultimate measure of modernization, rose from 5 billion kWh to 48 billion kWh, generated from massive dams like the Dnieper hydropower station or coal-fired plants sprouting around steel complexes. These numbers were not abstract statistics. They turned into real metal and engine objects. Tank factories like Kharkov and Chelyabinsk began rolling out T-26, BT-7, and later T-34 models, the tanks that would become legendary. A series of aircraft factories produced Polikarpov and Tupolev lines. Rural MASH engineering plants made parts previously imported from Germany and the United States. The whole country became a gigantic production line, each region handling a link: Urals smelting steel, Donbass mining coal, Leningrad making turbines, Moscow assembling machinery, Stalingrad producing tractors, then switching to tanks. The growth pace was so fast, the Soviet Union seemed to be fast-forwarded 3 times history. New cities sprang up around factories, railways expanded thousands of kilometers in a few years. The worker population surged as millions of peasants were pushed from villages into plants. Trains carrying ore, coal, and steel ran through the night, spewing thick smoke covering the eastern industrial skies. And during late 1930s parades, the world could see the machine's fruits: tanks lined up on Red Square, 122 mm and 152 mm artillery in rows, aircraft engines roaring overhead, declaring the Soviet Union was no longer the backward agricultural land of 1921. Western diplomats witnessing these scenes had to note in reports, "A transformation so fast it's hard to believe, as if a completely new nation has emerged from the ashes." But behind that extraordinary speed, the truth always loomed like a crack: low productivity, machinery worn from overload, exhausted workers, inflated reports, unstable product quality. This colossal industrial machine ran on 2 things: natural resources and drained human strength. The Soviet Union truly became an industrial superpower in 10-12 years, but not through advanced technology or investment capital, but through comprehensive coercion, a process where any weakness was covered by steel, orders, and fear. The achievements were real. The figures were real. The material power was real. But the price was no less real: And therefore one thing must be said clearly. This was not a miracle. This was a forced miracle. But beneath those dazzling figures and the parades of tanks showcasing power was a different story, dark and heavy. The story of the price the Soviet Union had to pay for that extraordinary speed. It was during the fastest phase of industrialization that the country witnessed one of the worst tragedies of the 20th century, the 1932-33 famine, particularly devastating in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Volga region. As grain was requisitioned beyond limits to serve exports and feed industrial cities, millions of peasants were left with empty granaries right in the middle of winter. The Holodomor was not just a humanitarian tragedy. It also exposed the truth that the Soviet Union's industrialization speed was built on naked expropriation. In the cities, steel and power plants blazed brightly all night, but consumer goods nearly vanished. The absolute rationing system controlled everything. Meat, sugar, butter, fabric, soap, even shoes had to be obtained with coupons, while quality was so low that people often quipped, rubber boots leak and leather shoes last only a few weeks. Stores were empty, and endless lines became a hallmark of Soviet urban life, queuing for bread at dawn, for meat at noon, for coal in the afternoon, and for clothing no matter the season. Housing was also severely scarce. Millions of families crammed into communal apartments, where 4 or 5 families shared one kitchen, one bathroom, and spaces so tight that many had to sleep in the kitchen or hallway. Meanwhile, labor productivity was extremely low because the unrealistic quota system created a culture of coping. Workers chased quantity, not quality. Foremen inflated achievements to avoid blame. Leaders reported overfulfillment for fear of purges. Machinery ran 24/7s and broke down constantly. Spare parts shortages forced factories to improvise replacements. Defective products flooded the market, but no one dared report them. Bottlenecks appeared everywhere. Steel but no bolts, electricity but no wiring, truck factories but no tires. Each broken link paralyzed the entire chain. An economy designed for speed had become an overloaded body, always running in a state of malnutrition. While massive industrial complexes like Magnitogorsk or Romash received nearly unlimited resources, essential sectors like textiles, housing, healthcare, or urban transport were neglected to the point of stagnation. People had to use cloth coupons to sew their own clothes. Soap became a luxury. City trams were packed like sardine cans. Hospitals lacked medicine to the point of reusing needles. And all this unfolded amid bombastic propaganda about the workers' paradise, a paradise that existed only on wall posters, while real life drowned in chronic shortages. At the industrial level, the Soviet Union shone like a blazing star, steel, coal, electricity, tanks, aircraft, all multiplying exponentially. But at the civilian level, the country sank into darkness. Hunger, cold, lack of goods, living standards so low that many areas were no different from the previous century. That industrial miracle was truly brilliant, but brilliant only in the spots that were illuminated. The majority of the country lived in the shadows that speed had created. But the darkness of shortages was not the most terrifying part. What was more horrifying was how the system protected its speed by devouring the very people who had created it. As the Soviet Union entered the late 1930s, the obsession with saboteurs began to spread, then exploded into the Great Purge of 1937-38, a period when about 680,000 people were executed and over 1 million others were sent to the Gulag. On the surface, the purge was described as a campaign to cleanse the ranks. In reality, it became a frenzied vortex sweeping up the entire technocratic elite, the very people who had directly built industrialization. A factory missing deadlines, a malfunctioning turbine, or output figures below projections could lead to the chief engineer being arrested in the night. If a steel furnace failed, the factory director was accused of sabotage. If coal mining fell short of plan, the mine foreman was taken for interrogation. Even Gospelin leaders, those who calculated the targets, were not safe. The contradiction between real capacity and irrational goals kept them always on the edge of life and death. Every report became a gamble. Tell the truth and risk danger. Lie and survive a little longer. And in that atmosphere, fulfilling the plan was no longer an economic challenge, but a survival one. The more people arrested, the more the remaining ones feared and had to beautify the data. Actual output declined, but reports sent to the center showed extraordinary growth. A parallel world where numbers were both shield and trap. In factories, workers were forced to chase ever higher quotas despite broken equipment and material shortages. In coal mines, workers labored in dim light and unsafe conditions because experienced engineers had been purged. Many industrial zones fell into chaos as the most capable disappeared without anyone daring to question it. Fear seeped into every layer of the apparatus. Mid-level cadres denounced superiors to save themselves. Foremen accused workers to keep their positions. Even in families, spouses dared not speak truthfully to each other because one slip of the tongue could lead to a death sentence. From a political tool, the purge quickly became the core operating mechanism of the entire system. The industrialization machine ran not just on orders, not just on coal and steel, but on terror permeating society. The paradox was that this very fear helped the state maintain the illusion of progress. The more unrealistic the targets, the prettier the figures, the more suspicion, the stronger the purges, a self-sustaining spiral that no one could stop. And then the truth became clear. The Soviet industrialization miracle had begun devouring its own creators. Engineers, planners, factory directors, those once praised as architects of the future, now became victims of the machine they had helped build. As some historians have said, the miracle devoured its own architects. Behind the light of steel and electricity was the darkness of erased fates, as if the Soviet Union could only maintain speed by continuously sacrificing the people who had made that speed possible. The purges had barely subsided when a colossal challenge struck, and it was this challenge that revealed the second phase of the forced miracle, comprehensive mobilization, that no free society could replicate. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union was caught off guard by the speed and scale of the attack, but the heavy industry that Stalin had forced the entire country to build in the 1930s became the only shield preventing national collapse. In the first week alone, hundreds of factories in Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic region, and much of Western Russia fell into the combat zone. But instead of abandoning them, the Soviet state chose the unimaginable, evacuating 1,500 factories beyond the Urals in just a few months, a campaign military historians consider one of the largest industrial relocations in human history. Massive machinery was disassembled overnight, loaded onto trains, transported over bomb-damaged railways. Workers, engineers, and their families slept on train car floors or in freezing warehouses waiting for the next convoy. In the empty lands of Siberia and Central Asia, factories were rebuilt from scratch in conditions lacking water, electricity, and housing. But the coercive model of the previous decade, where no one had the right to refuse orders, allowed the Soviet state to achieve what other nations could only dream of, forcing the entire society into war mode in almost zero time. Freedom vanished completely. Every citizen of working age was mobilized, every railway line was prioritized for military use, every factory, regardless of prior type, had to serve the war. The Gazay truck plant switched to tank engines, the Stalingrad tractor factory began assembling T-34 SES, Euromash engineering plants produced self-propelled guns and tank parts, shipyards in Murmansk and Leningrad operated through the night despite bombs. The state imposed strict rations, pushing millions of women, students, even the elderly into production lines. There was no room for the individual, only quotas, orders, and national survival. It was this super-centralization, absolute power concentrated in the state, that enabled the Soviet Union to recover industrial capacity in the time Germany thought sufficient for victory. By 1943, the Soviet Union produced more tanks than Germany, more artillery than the entire Axis combined, and fighter aircraft numbers kept rising. The production speed of Eastern factories astonished Wehrmacht officers. Despite losing most Western industry, the Soviet Union not only avoided collapse but continued expanding the war's scale. Military historian John Erickson once commented, "No nation in World War II mobilized to the absolute degree of the Soviet Union. This was total war economy at an unprecedented level." The 1945 victory was a direct result of that comprehensive mobilization, but that victory came at a price beyond imagination. 27 million dead soldiers, workers, peasants, civilians killed by bombs, the elderly and children starving in sieges like Leningrad. Factories ran through the night, but the lights inside could not obscure millions of new graves. The evacuation trains carried not just machinery but generations of youth who never returned. Their sacrifice, voluntary or forced, became fuel for the colossal war machine. The Soviet Union survived, defeated one of the world's mightiest military machines, and proved that the forced industrialization model could generate national power at levels hard for free systems to reach. But this truth must never be forgotten. Victory was bought with the speed the state imposed, and that speed was bought with the lives of tens of millions. The war ended. The T-34 tanks fell silent, and the eastern factories returned to peacetime production rhythms. But the legacy of the forced industrialization model remained deeply etched into the economic, social, and psychological structure of an entire empire. What the Soviet Union achieved was real. An impoverished agricultural nation transformed into an industrial superpower in just over a decade, an exhausted country becoming a military force, strong enough to halt Nazi Germany, a peasant society coerced but ultimately producing steel complexes, tanks, and aircraft that astonished the world. But the price of that miracle was equally real. Millions dead in the 1932-33 famine, millions more vanishing in the Gulag, freedom nearly erased from public life, and an economy operating on fear rather than creativity. The Soviet miracle was a miracle of speed, but speed paid for in blood. And though that model helped defeat fascism, it also created a distorted economic framework that lasted 70 years. Consumer goods shortages, low productivity, absolute military priority, fictitious reports, and a stagnant bureaucracy that even late 1987 reforms could not salvage. The Soviet Union proved a simple but ruthless truth. Speed can be bought with blood, but forced growth always has a ceiling. When you push an economy beyond its natural limits, you can create feats in the short term, but you also create structural cracks that spread over time, eventually shattering the very foundation you tried to build. That lesson does not belong only to the 20th century. In today's world, when geopolitics fragments, when power competition returns, when nations fear being left behind, the temptation of forced mobilization models may resurface. Governments may concentrate power, tighten freedoms, push heavy industry, prioritize security over free growth. They may believe that new speed is what decides, that there is not enough time for the moderate path. But Soviet history reminds us that any model using coercion instead of productivity, commands instead of innovation, fear instead of motivation, must pay a price. It may be a price in the present, it may be a price in the future, but it certainly cannot be escaped. When looking back at the Soviet industrialization miracle, what matters is not just seeing how fast it was, but seeing why it was fast, because it consumed people like fuel and dragged an entire society into a race no one was allowed to stop. And therefore, the final warning cannot be ignored. If you want to understand the future of superpowers, look at the empire that tried to grow faster than history allowed.